Hello everyone, and welcome back. There are certain mornings when the world seems steady. The light comes in the same way, the coffee tastes familiar, and the air hums with the sound of something working as it should. That is how it began on Wall Street in October 1929, a morning that looked ordinary, felt routine, and carried the calm before a storm no one truly expected. You can almost picture it, the marble steps shining under a pale sun, brokers in pressed suits and hats passing each other with quiet confidence, the rattle of ticker tape echoing through tall windows. To the outside world, this was the temple of progress, a machine that turned optimism into wealth. Every whisper on the trading floor promised another rise, another record, another chance to turn belief into gold. But that morning, belief itself was about to break. The New York Stock Exchange did not roar awake. It cracked. It started with a hesitation, a slight hitch in the ticker, like a heart missing a beat. Someone noticed that a major stock, maybe steel, maybe automobiles, had dipped lower than it should have. Phones began to ring. A secretary hurried past with fresh printouts. Voices grew sharper, tighter, and before anyone could process what was happening, the room turned into a storm. The numbers fell. The air thickened. People shouted into receivers that no longer answered. Papers fluttered to the floor. What had been a hum of commerce became the sound of panic breathing through hundreds of throats at once. It was not only money that was disappearing, it was certainty. For years, the American dream had been dressed in optimism. The 1,920 seconds were all rhythm and invention. Jazz, radios, airplanes, skyscrapers that stretched toward heaven. People bought stocks on margin, borrowing money they did not have to chase a fortune they believed was waiting for them. Everyone seemed to win, and even caution looked foolish. Why save when you could invest? Why question the future when every chart pointed upward? Yet in that moment, when prices plunged faster than eyes could follow, something deeper than wealth collapsed. It was trust. Trust that the system made sense, that hard work and belief could outpace risk. The market had been a mirror, reflecting a nation's confidence. Now it showed only fear. Imagine standing there, your tie too tight, your hands damp, your voice hoarse from calling clients who suddenly stopped answering. The floor beneath you feels unsteady, as if the marble itself knows what is coming. Outside, the street fills with rumor. The newspapers will later print headlines of doom. Some will claim people leapt from windows that day. In truth, few did, but the myth survives because it felt true. People felt like jumping. Because when everything you built in your mind evaporates, falling becomes a metaphor you can't escape. The fall was not only financial, it was psychological. To understand that morning, you have to step into the minds of those inside it. Picture a young clerk, perhaps 23, watching the ticker jam for the first time. He does not yet know what it means. His supervisor tells him to stay calm, but the words ring hollow. He looks at the paper spilling from the machine, a stream of numbers bleeding red, and senses that the noise around him is not just confusion, it is the sound of something enormous breaking apart. In another office across the street, a banker sips his coffee slowly, pretending the taste has not gone bitter. He has been through market dips before. It will pass, he tells himself. He even says it aloud, to the man sitting beside him who does not reply. But when the phone rings again, and another client demands answers, he feels a hollow space open in his chest. What if it does not pass? What if this is the moment the music stops? Outside, the wind picks up. Paper flutters through the air. Cancelled orders, frantic notes, headlines half printed. Men stand in clusters near the exchange doors, waiting for news that changes by the second. No one knows which rumour to believe. Some say the bankers' consortium will save the day. Others whisper that the banks themselves are drowning. A woman selling newspapers on the corner counts her coins twice. Even she can feel it. The city's heartbeat stuttering, and somewhere a journalist types the words Wall Street in panic. It will become tomorrow's truth. By mid-afternoon, the floor is chaos. Prices are collapsing so fast that clerks can't update the chalkboards quickly enough. The ticker runs hours behind real time. Investors crowd around, demanding updates, their faces pale with disbelief. There is sweat on every collar, ink on every cuff. The air smells like smoke and anxiety. Someone jokes that the market just needs a long weekend. The laughter dies before it finishes. The most haunting thing about that day is not the noise, it is the silence that follows. After the bell finally rings, the room does not empty right away. People linger, staring at the floor, not speaking. Some pick up scattered papers, fold them neatly, then drop them again as if realizing it no longer matters. The market is closed, but the damage keeps working its way outward, invisible and unstoppable. For some, it is just numbers. For others, it is everything: homes mortgaged, savings borrowed, reputations built on borrowed trust. That night, offices stay lit long past midnight as men rewrite ledgers, searching for logic in the wreckage. There is none. When dawn comes again, it feels different. The sunlight still touches the same marble steps, but the men who walk up them carry something heavier than briefcases. They carry shame, confusion, disbelief. They used to talk about opportunity. Now they whisper about survival. It is easy, decades later, to think of the crash as a line in a history book, a cause, an effect, a number. But in 1929, it was not an event. It was an atmosphere. It seeped into coffee cups, into headlines, into the nervous laughter of people pretending everything was fine. And maybe that is why the story still echoes. Because we recognize the pattern. We know what it feels like when confidence blinds us. When optimism becomes arrogance. When we think the ladder has no end until it gives way beneath us. What collapsed that morning was not only the market, it was a kind of faith, the belief that prosperity was permanent. That risk was an illusion. The crash did not invent fear, it revealed it. Decades later, the images remain vivid, ticker tape swirling in the gutters like snow, shoes scuffing across marble floors, a man standing still while the crowd rushes past him. He does not move because he can't yet believe it is real. He thinks maybe if he stands still enough, the world will rewind. But time does not rewind. The crash spread like water through cracks into small towns, factories, farms. Banks folded. Jobs vanished. Families lined up for bread. And yet, at the center of it all, the moment of collapse remained strangely quiet. It was not a cinematic explosion. It was the slow recognition that things do not always break loudly. Sometimes they just stop working. That truth unsettles us even now. Because most people imagine disaster as visible, flames, alarms, screaming crowds. But the greatest collapses are often invisible while they are happening. They begin as hesitations, ignored warnings, small patterns no one wants to see. The men and women of 1929 did not wake up planning to witness history. They woke up planning to work, to trade, to meet clients for lunch. By sunset, some of them no longer had jobs, homes, or confidence. The world had shifted beneath their feet, and there was no script for what came next. Yet, amid the wreckage, something else quietly persisted. People still gathered for dinner, even if the portions were smaller. Someone still played a piano in a dim bar, the melody softer but alive. The city did not vanish. It adapted. The same buildings that echoed with panic by day glowed faintly with resilience by night. That is the paradox of collapse, destruction, and endurance share the same space. Even as things fall apart, life keeps going in stubborn, quiet ways. Looking back, the crash seems inevitable, a correction waiting to happen. But inside that moment, it was chaos without context. No one knew how deep it would go or how long it would last. That is what makes it haunting, the unknowing, the realization that certainty is a luxury, not a guarantee. So, when we talk about the moment of collapse, we are not really talking about Wall Street or stocks. We are talking about the instant when reality reclaims its power from illusion. When the story we have told ourselves about wealth, about progress, about control meets gravity, and gravity always wins. In the days that followed, people searched for reasons, for villains, for signs they should have seen. Some blamed speculation, some greed, some fate. But the truth was more ordinary. The system was built on faith, and faith is fragile when measured in dollars. Still, there is something deeply human about it. The need to believe, to trust that the line keeps going up, to think we have finally mastered uncertainty. Maybe that is why the story of 1929 feels timeless. Because it is not just about markets. It is about us. We build things, businesses, identities, dreams, and we forget that they rest on something as uncertain as confidence. We celebrate the rise and ignore the cracks. Until one morning, the light hits differently, the ticker stutters, and the hum turns to a roar. That is the sound of illusion breaking. And yet, even then, the story is not over. Because for every collapse, there is someone who stays, who rebuilds, who refuses to let fear write the ending. The crash was brutal, yes, but it was also a reminder that even in failure, there is proof of endurance. When the dust settled, the marble still stood, the sun still rose, and the world kept trying. Maybe that is the quiet truth hidden in the noise of 1929, that we fall, we panic, we lose, but then, somehow, we live again. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists before something breaks. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of too much ease. That is how America sounded in the months leading up to October 1929. The air was full of jazz and radio static, the smell of gasoline and new paint. Cars were multiplying on the roads, cities were glowing brighter each night, and people spoke of prosperity as if it were permanent. The decade had rhythm, fast, shiny, confident. Factories roared, stock prices climbed, and optimism became the country's favorite currency. If you had lived in that time, You would have felt it everywhere. Every newspaper headline bragged of records broken. Every neighbor seemed to have a new plan to get in on the market. Housewives, teachers, clerks, and taxi drivers were buying stocks on borrowed money, their faith in growth stronger than any regulation could restrain. It was not greed so much as collective belief, a conviction that modern America had outsmarted risk itself. The stock ticker became a kind of heartbeat for the nation. Every uptick whispered, "We are safe." Every small dip was brushed off as healthy correction. The economy had become a mirror of human confidence. The higher people felt, the higher the numbers rose. And as long as everyone believed, the illusion held. It is easy now to see it as naivete, but at the time it felt like destiny. The war was over, technology was booming, and credit was the magic word that turned wishes into reality. Banks encouraged loans. Advertising told people that success was a right, not a privilege. "Buy now, pay later," said the slogans, and people listened. The atmosphere was so full of progress that doubt looked like failure. Those who warned about speculation were mocked as gloom merchants. The press called them prophets of panic. Nobody wanted to listen to caution when the orchestra was playing so loud. In the middle of all that noise stood Wall Street, a canyon of stone and ambition. Inside the exchange, the rhythm of success was physical, the ticking machines, the voices of traders echoing off marble walls, the faint metallic scent of coins and ink. Men in pressed suits would arrive early, carrying the confidence of a country that had never truly lost. One of them might have been you. You wake early, put on your best tie, and walk through the canyon of skyscrapers. The morning air smells like rain on concrete. When you stop for a newspaper, the headline reads, "Stocks reach new highs." You fold it neatly, as if it were proof that the world works exactly as it should. Your office is a blend of order and energy. A secretary sharpens pencils. The ticker machine clatters in the corner. You hang your coat, nod to your colleagues, pour coffee into a china cup. The routine feels solid, like stone. The phone rings every few minutes. Clients eager to buy, never to sell. There is laughter in the background, the light-hearted kind that comes from people who've never truly been afraid. You do not know it yet, but the system you trust is already cracking. A few economists' rare voices in the din had begun to warn that stock prices were rising far beyond their real value. Factory production had slowed slightly. Farmers were struggling with debt. The signs were faint, buried under the noise of optimism. But no one wanted to see the pattern forming, because seeing it would mean admitting the music might stop. That is the psychology of a boom. When things go well for too long, people forget the rules. Risk starts to look like courage. Debt feels like opportunity. And the idea of too much disappears from the vocabulary. By early autumn of 1929, credit was stretched to the limit. Millions of ordinary Americans were buying stocks with borrowed money, paying only a small fraction up front and promising the rest later. Brokers encouraged it, banks enabled it, and the illusion deepened. The market became a house built on margin, fragile as glass but glittering under the sun. Then came the tremors. It started quietly, just a few uneasy headlines. A big investor sold a large block of shares. Prices dipped. A few more followed. It looked harmless, even healthy. Markets always moved up and down. But this time, something subtle had changed. The buyers did not rush in to rescue prices. The confidence that had floated the market for years began to thin, like fog burning off under morning light. Inside offices, the tone shifted. Jokes became shorter. Laughter turned forced. People watched the ticker tape more closely, eyes flicking at every number. Clients called more often, their voices tight. "Should we sell?" they asked. And brokers replied with the old refrain, "Stay calm. This is temporary." Temporary. It is a word that holds hope and denial at once. As the days passed, the dips deepened. Some stocks fell faster than others. A few small banks started recalling loans. That is when the calm began to crack. Because the market was not just a financial system, it was a mood. And once moods turn, they rarely turn back gently. Rumors started to circulate. Some claimed a major firm was about to fail. Others said powerful bankers were meeting in secret to stabilize prices. Reporters lingered near the exchange steps, listening for hints. Every whisper became a spark, every headline a gust of wind. By the third week of October, tension was thick enough to taste. People began skipping lunch to watch the board. The ticker machine, which once sang a song of endless growth, now rattled like a nervous heartbeat. And yet, strangely, life outside Wall Street remained deceptively normal. Uptown, jazz bands still played. In small towns, people went to the movies, unaware that the world's richest market was teetering. Even on the trading floor, between the waves of anxiety, men still smiled. Because how could the dream end? How could something so vast, so sure of itself, simply fail? That is the cruel beauty of bubbles. They feel eternal until the moment they burst. It is said that the real crash was not a single day. It was a slow motion, unraveling. Each moment of calm only disguised the next wave of collapse. Behind every polite smile, every calm reassurance, was the same quiet question. What if we are wrong this time? The newspapers kept publishing cheerful editorials. Politicians promised stability. But beneath the optimism, something ancient stirred, the old fear of losing control. It had been buried for years under jazz and champagne, but it was still there, waiting. By the time the market opened on the morning of October 24, that fear had found its voice. Traders arrived early, faces drawn, eyes scanning headlines. A few said nothing, just went straight to their desks. Others cracked small jokes, trying to ward off the inevitable. The ticker began printing, and at first it was calm numbers holding steady, then dipping slightly. Then the orders began to flood in. Sell, 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 and the silence that had lingered for months shattered. The calm of the roaring 20s, the smooth rhythm of easy money broke apart in a single collective gasp. What had felt like progress revealed itself as fragility. The dance floor emptied. The music stopped. No one in that room could have described the sound of the moment the dream died. But they remembered the feeling, the way the light seemed colder, the way every noise became sharper, the way a simple number could make a man's stomach drop. And that is how calm turns to chaos. Not with thunder, but with recognition. When you look back at photographs of those days, the faces tell the story better than any statistic. Disbelief, mixed with pride, the stubborn refusal to admit it is over. Some stare at the ticker tape as though it might apologize. Others stand at windows, silent, watching the city move on without them. The truth is, the crash did not begin when the market fell. It began when people stopped believing it could not. Before October, success was a habit. After October, it became a memory. The same men who once celebrated gains now clutched newspapers with trembling hands. Families who had spoken of vacations now spoke of rent. The same optimism that had built the decade turned into its undoing. From calm to chaos, the distance is smaller than we think. It is measured not in numbers, but in trust. That is why history keeps echoing this story. Not because of how much money was lost, but because of how quickly belief can vanish. Every age has its version of the calm, the illusion that progress is permanent, that systems can't fail, that the tide will never turn. And every age learns again how fragile that illusion really is. The chaos of 1929 was more than a financial event, it was a mirror. It showed a nation what it looks like when certainty runs out. The streets did not explode. The stars did not fall. But something invisible broke the link between confidence and reality. And once it broke, it could not be repaired overnight. The years that followed would bring hardship, reform, and rediscovery. But on that quiet morning, when the market first trembled, all of that was still unseen. What the world saw, instead, was a simple, terrifying truth. The calm had been a disguise all along. The New York Stock Exchange was never meant to be silent. It breathed in shouts, in the thump of shoes against marble, in the metallic whir of the ticker machines printing fortunes line by line. On an ordinary day, the floor was chaos in harmony, 100 conversations overlapping, each one a different note in the same song of ambition. But on October 24, 1929, that music twisted. The first minutes after the opening bell felt normal enough. Brokers called out bids. Runners darted through narrow aisles with slips of paper. Clerks scribbled numbers faster than their pencils could keep up. The ticker machine hummed in rhythm with confidence. It was supposed to be just another morning. Then, quietly, the numbers started to fall. At first, no one panicked. Stocks dipped all the time. A few murmured about profit-taking, others about healthy correction. You told yourself the same thing markets breathe. They expand and contract, and this was just a deep breath before the next climb. You said it again, out loud this time, to convince yourself. But then the orders came faster. Sell, sell, sell. The ticker stuttered, jammed for a second, then started again, spitting out figures so low that one broker swore it must be broken. A murmur spread through the floor. Heads lifted from ledgers. Someone shouted across the room, "Is this right?" No one answered. The air thickened. You could hear it, the pitch of voices rising, the scrape of shoes, the tremor in laughter that no longer sounded like laughter. Phones began ringing non-stop. Clerks dashed between desks, papers spilling from their hands. One man near the entrance tried to light a cigarette 3 times before giving up. The ticker could not keep up anymore. Prices were changing too quickly. By the time a trade printed, it was already wrong. The room was working blind. That is when the shouting began. Sell it all. One client screamed through the telephone line. Another begged, "Hold, please just hold." You looked around and saw men you thought were unshakable, leaning against their desks, faces grey. The marble walls that once seemed proud now just felt cold. Someone near the center of the room dropped a stack of reports, and the fluttering papers drew every eye for a second, like birds startled by thunder. And still the numbers kept falling. For hours, the ticker tape poured out like confetti at a funeral. The paper coiled on the floor in white drifts, winding between black shoes polished that morning for a different kind of day. It was like watching snow fall inside a furnace, quiet, endless, unreal. A few men tried to keep order. Senior brokers shouted commands, their voices cutting through the panic like whip cracks. Stay at your posts. No one leaves the floor. But their authority was shrinking by the minute. Fear moves faster than leadership. By mid-morning, the noise was unbearable. The phones had become conduits for dread. A clerk ran past you, face pale, muttering something about another bank calling in loans. The smell of sweat mixed with cigarette smoke and ink. The whole room pulsed with heat. And somewhere above the noise, someone laughed. Not because it was funny, because disbelief had nowhere else to go. By noon, people stopped pretending. The laughter died, replaced by an eerie rhythm of voices calling out figures like confessions. Steel, 195. No, centok tanta due. Now, 169. General Electric, down 20 points. Radio, half its value. There was a sound that day. No one forgot the clatter of the ticker when it jammed completely. Then started again, printing losses like a drumbeat. Outside, crowds began to gather. The word had spread beyond the exchange. Something was happening, something bad. By early afternoon, thousands of people stood in the narrow street, craning their necks, watching the windows. You stepped to the edge of the trading floor and looked through the glass. The crowd below looked like a single organism, heads moving together, waves of murmurs rising each time a runner came down the stairs with an update. Some faces were angry, others blank. Everyone was waiting for a miracle that was not coming. Back inside, the exhaustion began to show. Ties loosened. Shirts clung to backs. The heat of too many bodies, too much fear, made the air thick enough to taste. You could hear whispers about men ruined before lunch, entire firms evaporating between phone calls. The ticker, once a symbol of progress, now looked like an executioner's tool. A runner stumbled, caught himself, and laughed bitterly. "I have been running numbers since I was 16, he said to no one. "Guess this is the day they run me." The floor had become a stage for disbelief. Each man trying to appear composed while privately counting the pieces of his life he might still save. A few shouted instructions into phones that no longer connected anywhere. Others just stared at the walls, lips moving, in silent arithmetic. The exchange officials called for calm. The loudspeaker crackled with reassurances from major bankers, promising stabilization. For a moment, the volume dropped. People stopped moving, as if the words could somehow glue the world back together. But then, another wave of sell orders hit the floor, and the roar came back louder this time. You realized something simple and terrible. No one was in control anymore. That was the real shock, not the losses, not the numbers, but the discovery that the entire system everyone trusted was running on faith alone. The structure had no engine once. Belief stopped powering it. It is said that people fainted that day. A few did, but most stayed standing, out of pride, out of habit. They kept writing, shouting, trading as if the performance could change the ending. By late afternoon, Voices were hoarse. The floor smelled of panic and paper dust. You saw one of your colleagues, an older man with silver hair, staring at the ticker as if it were an old friend dying in front of him. When someone touched his shoulder, he flinched. Then, quietly, he said, "It is all gone." Those words carried farther than he intended. You could feel them pass through the room like a chill. It is all gone. And in that moment, something collective broke. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of trading, the noise did not stop right away. It hung in the air, a ghostly echo of what had been normal just a day before. People stood frozen for a few seconds, as if waiting for permission to breathe again. Then, slowly, they began to move. Some gathered their papers mechanically, though the numbers meant nothing now. Others simply stared at the ticker tape on the floor, white against black shoes, and walked out without saying a word. The street outside was darker than usual, the sky heavy with late autumn haze. The crowd had thinned, but not vanished. Reporters hovered near the entrance, pencils ready. A man brushed past you, muttering, "It will come back tomorrow." Maybe he believed it. Maybe he needed to. You stepped onto the sidewalk. The echo of footsteps, the rustle of discarded tape in the gutter, it all felt unreal, like a dream unspooling. Across the street, a shoe-shine boy packed his kit early. The city looked the same but sounded different. The energy that had once been ambition now felt like aftermath. Behind you, the exchange doors closed with a heavy thud. For the first time in years, the heart of capitalism sounded like it was holding its breath. People would call it Black Thursday, but the darkness was not in the sky. It was in the realization that no amount of noise, no volume of shouting, could drown out the truth. The party was over. That night, in bars across Lower Manhattan, the survivors gathered, not to celebrate, not even to mourn, but to sit in stunned silence. Drinks went untouched. Conversations started and died in mid-sentence. Someone ordered another round, then left before it arrived. The trading floor had followed them there, the echo of the day replaying in their heads. The paper snow, the smell of sweat and ink, the moment when the numbers turned from fortune to fiction. And for many, that sound never left them. Because once you have stood inside a system collapsing under its own weight, every future success carries a shadow. You learn that order is temporary, that confidence is fragile, that progress hums only as long as people keep believing in the hum. That is what the trading floor taught the world in 1929. Not how to make or lose money, but how quickly certainty can dissolve into noise. When the dust of panic began to settle, stories rose to take its place. It is what humans do when chaos leaves them speechless. We build narratives to fill the silence. In the days after the crash, the most enduring story took shape almost instantly. That men in suits, brokers, bankers, millionaires, had hurled themselves from office windows in despair. The suicides of 29, the headlines called them. The newspapers printed them like parables, moral lessons for a nation waking from its fever dream of easy wealth. But history, as it often does, turned rumor into scripture. The image was cinematic, a tall building against a grey Manhattan sky, the sound of a distant siren, a hat tumbling after a falling figure. Reporters did not need proof, only poetry. Readers did not need evidence. They needed catharsis. The idea that the mighty had literally fallen satisfied something deep in the collective psyche. It gave shape to the fear everyone felt if they could fall, anyone could. Yet when you dig beneath the myth, the truth is smaller, quieter, and sadder. In reality, very few people jumped in those early days. Archival reports confirm only a handful of deaths directly tied to the crash itself. Most people did not leap from windows. They went home, sat at their kitchen tables, and stared at numbers they could not make sense of. They folded newspapers without reading them. They said little at dinner. Some did not show up at work to next day. Not because they were died, but because they could not bear to walk back into a room that smelled like failure. The legend, though, was too powerful to die. By November, cartoons in newspapers showed top hats and briefcases falling through the sky. Sermons referenced men who traded their souls for stock. Hollywood picked up the imagery, dark windows, falling papers, a single scream that echoed through the canyons of Wall Street. It was melodrama, yes, but it worked because it felt emotionally true. The truth rarely travels as fast as the story people want to believe. To understand why that myth took hold, you have to see what it represented. The 1,920 seconds had been an age of upward motion, literally and symbolically. Skyscrapers reached higher each year, each new one promising that ambition could outclimb gravity. People believed in vertical progress, from poor to rich, from clerk to executive, from renter to owner. Up was the word of the decade. So when the crash came, falling became the only metaphor that made sense. The newspapers were not just describing tragedy, they were translating emotion. The fall from a window stood for the fall from illusion. It was the physical embodiment of the phrase, "the bottom dropped out." It turned an abstract financial collapse into something visceral. There is a strange human comfort in that. When we can visualize a disaster, we think we understand it. We say, that is what it looks like, men jumping from windows. It is neater than the truth, which is harder to digest, that collapse often happens in stillness, in silence, in invisible ways. Some historians suggest that the myth grew because people needed punishment. The 1,920 seconds had been a party. The crash was the hangover. It was not enough for wealth to disappear. It had to be atoned for. The image of men plunging from buildings felt like moral justice, a balancing of cosmic scales. Yet, if you had walked the streets of Lower Manhattan that week, you would not have seen bodies. You would have seen men walking slowly, hands in pockets, staring at the pavement as if it were suddenly unfamiliar. You would have heard quieter sounds, the soft rip of ticker tape underfoot, the distant hum of traffic, the muffled sob of someone trying not to make a scene. That is the real sound of despair. Not screaming, just the absence of what used to be normal. There was one story that did happen. A clerk named Mrs. Pand Borowski, who worked for a brokerage firm for nearly 3 decades, fainted from exhaustion and later took her own life. It was tragic, but it was also ordinary, not the cinematic leap people imagined. She was not rich. She was not reckless. She was tired. And maybe that is what made the myth thrive. The real tragedy was too small to headline. Ordinary exhaustion does not sell newspapers. Epic downfall does. Soon, the myth travelled beyond New York. Papers in Chicago, London, and Paris reprinted exaggerated accounts of brokers raining from skyscrapers. Each retelling added more bodies, more drama. It became not just an American story, but a global cautionary tale, a reminder that capitalism, like Icarus, could fly too close to the sun. The power of that image lingered for decades. During later recessions, 1946, 1987, 2008, the same headlines reappeared. Will history repeat itself? The photograph of Wall Street's facade, the shadowed windows, the fear of falling, it has become shorthand for financial apocalypse. Even now, when markets dip, social media jokes resurface about open windows on Wall Street. It is morbid. Yes, but it shows how myth outlives reality. There is something telling about that endurance. The crash became not just an event, but a parable of hubris. The myth of the jumpers offered a simple narrative. Greed leads to ruin, arrogance leads to fall, excess invites gravity. It is easy to understand, easy to moralize, and in that simplicity lies its strength. But the truth, as always, is more complicated. The real victims were not the caricatures of top-hatted millionaires throwing themselves from penthouses. They were everyday people whose worlds shrank: overnight secretaries, factory workers, small-town shopkeepers. They did not fall from windows. They fell quietly through the cracks of a collapsing economy. There is a kind of dignity in their silence. No grand gestures, no newspaper front pages, just persistence, the long, slow work of surviving humiliation. That is why the myth matters, even as a lie, because it reveals something honest about fear. We would rather imagine a dramatic end than face a long uncertainty. We want closure, even if it is fabricated. The jumpers gave people that closure, a way to turn confusion into a story with a final image. But look closer, and you will see the deeper irony. The myth of falling was born from a culture obsessed with rising. America had built its identity on ascent, the dream of reaching higher, earning more, building bigger. The skyscraper was not just architecture, it was ideology in stone. Every floor up meant success, and the sky itself became a symbol of limitless potential. The fall was never supposed to happen. So when it did, it needed myth to make sense of it. In that way, the story of the jumpers was not about suicide. It was about disillusionment. A society that believed in endless ascent suddenly met gravity, and the shock was too much to process without turning it into legend. Decades later, historians, journalists, and economists have debunked the tale again and again. But myths are stubborn. Facts can correct the record, but they can't erase the emotional truth people cling to. The image of a man standing at a window, realizing too late that belief can't defy gravity, it stays. Because it feels true, even if it is not. And maybe that is what makes it so haunting. The myth of the fall is not really about 1929. It is about all the moments when human confidence meets the edge of its own creation. It is about the way we build towers of money, of ego, of faith, and forget that every tower casts a shadow. When the wind changes, when the foundation shifts, when the numbers start to crumble, we look down and remember how high we have climbed. That is when fear becomes physical. Not because we are about to fall, but because we realize we were never built to live this high without balance. The window becomes a mirror. We see ourselves reflected in it, not jumping, but staring, wondering how it all went wrong. And perhaps that is why the myth endures, because it is not about those men in 1929. It is about us, about what happens when belief outruns reason, about the human need to find beauty, or at least meaning, in collapse. Maybe we keep retelling it because, deep down, we know how close we all are to that window standing at the edge of something we thought was solid, watching it tremble, and pretending we are not afraid. When myths harden into memory, the real faces behind them start to blur. That is what happened in the weeks after the crash rumor replaced reality, and the quiet truths got buried under headlines that needed drama. The truth was far less cinematic, far more human. In the aftermath, New York did not look like a battlefield. It looked like a city holding its breath. Offices stayed open, though quieter. Newspapers fluttered in gutters, their ink still shouting panic from yesterday. Men who had once walked with quick, confident strides now moved slower, like they were listening for aftershocks beneath the pavement. Most people did not leap from windows. They sat at desks, stared at balance sheets, and realized they did not understand what they were looking at anymore. The math did not make sense. The numbers refused to behave. They had been trained to believe that the market followed rules that rewarded intelligence, hard work, and timing. But now, the rules had vanished overnight. Logic dissolved with capital. It was as if gravity had suddenly changed direction and no one had received the memo. That is how disbelief begins, not in shouts, but in silence. There is an image that appears again and again in eyewitness accounts, men staring at ticker tapes as though hypnotized. They would watch the paper unspool, their hands trembling slightly, reading losses that grew faster than comprehension. Some tore the tape in half and threw it away, as if breaking the paper could stop the fall. But nothing stopped. One broker, interviewed years later, said he remembered a particular sound, a faint clicking from the ticker, irregular, mechanical, unfeeling. It was like a heart monitor after the patient's gone, he said, still moving but meaningless. That sound became the soundtrack of the depression before the depression, the moment when hope turned into arithmetic and arithmetic into grief. Take Harold, for instance. Not a real name, but a real story. He had worked 12 years for a brokerage firm on Broad Street. Started as a runner, made partner just last spring. He had a wife named Louise, 2 children, and a small house in Queens. They would just bought a piano on credit. On the morning of the crash, Harold arrived early, optimistic as ever. By afternoon, he would lost not just his savings, but the firm's entire client fund. When he came home that night, he sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. Louise found him still in his suit, tie loosened, staring at nothing. "What happens now?" she asked. He did not answer. Not because he did not know, because he could not believe there was an answer. The next day, he went back to work. So did everyone else. That is one of the things the legend forgets. People kept showing up. They typed memos, they made phone calls, they drank coffee that tasted of ash, and they kept pretending that stability might return. The world had ended, but the office still opened at 9. Reality, as it turns out, is more stubborn than myth. Another story, Miriam, a secretary in her 40s, who worked for a shipping company that had invested heavily in steel. She was not rich, not even close, but she would trusted her employer's optimism. When the market fell, so did her job. In a letter to a friend, she wrote, "The hardest thing is not hunger, but the silence. Everyone walks around, pretending not to be afraid. That line says more than any headline ever could. The silence after the crash was its own kind of grief. Banks tried to project calm. Brokers assured clients it was temporary. Even as companies folded, the city clung to performance. Newspapers printed smiling photographs of bankers stabilizing the market, as if confidence itself could be rebuilt through posture. But behind the facade, exhaustion set in. Doctors reported more cases of insomnia, anxiety, ulcers. Churches saw new faces every Sunday, men who had not prayed in years, suddenly sitting in pews, not out of faith, but out of confusion. Even the bars changed tone. Laughter turned quieter, eyes more distant. In truth, very few people chose dramatic endings. Most endured the long, slow one, the kind of despair that stretches into habit. In one account, a messenger boy who worked near Wall Street described finding an older broker sitting on a bench, his briefcase still beside him. The man asked the boy for the time, thanked him, then said, "Do not ever borrow what you can't understand." That line stuck with the boy his whole life. He told it decades later to a reporter, long after anyone remembered the man's name. But that one sentence captured the reality better than any myth. The crash was not a single explosion of tragedy. It was thousands of small implosions, private and unseen. And that is what makes it more haunting. Because a myth, for all its horror, is clean. It has a beginning and an end. The truth does not. It lingers. It grows quieter but heavier. It follows you home. For the people who lived it, the worst part was not the loss of money, it was the loss of direction. The stock market had been a compass, pointing toward progress. Now it spun wildly, and no one knew which way was up. Imagine waking every morning to the same skyline, the same streets, the same sounds, but everything underneath has shifted. That is what it felt like to live in New York after the crash. Outwardly unchanged, inwardly unmoored. And yet, within that quiet unraveling, small acts of grace appeared. A clerk slipping a few coins to a messenger so he could eat. A tailor mending suits for free because men still need dignity. A cafe owner keeping lights on late so people had somewhere warm to sit without questions. These moments do not make it into history books, but they mattered. They were reality, too, the soft counterweight to collapse. The legend of the window jumpers made the story grand. The truth made it human. And maybe that is why the truth gets forgotten, because it does not fit neatly into headlines. It does not explode, it erodes. But eroding takes courage. The men and women who stayed, who rebuilt, who learned to live without certainty, they carried the real burden of that era. They did not leap, they endured. Years later, when historians asked survivors what they remembered most, few mentioned panic. Most mentioned the quiet, the long walks home, the taste of cheap coffee, the feeling of walking into an office and pretending it still meant something. One said, "It was not the crash that changed us. It was the days after, when we realized the world goes on, even when you do not know how to." That sentence might be the truest thing ever said about 1929. The stories that survive of ticker, tape, of falling men are convenient symbols. But the reality behind them is more intimate, more painful, and somehow more hopeful. It is about the slow, stubborn nature of survival. Because when belief collapses, something else quietly rises to replace it not immediately, not cleanly, but eventually. Faith returns in smaller forms. A man sweeping the same steps every morning because routine is the only thing left to trust. A woman setting the same table even when dinner has grown meager. People learning that the opposite of collapse is not recovery, it is endurance. So maybe the myth had its place. It gave shape to a fear too big to name. But the truth, the real, unembellished truth, is what teaches. It reminds us that most of the world does not end in spectacle. It ends in silence, and then, if you are lucky, it begins again. And that is the part worth remembering, not who jumped, but who stayed. If you want to understand a collapse, do not start with numbers. Start with people. Statistics can tell you how deep the crash went, but they can't tell you what it felt like to sit in the middle of it. They do not describe the taste of cold coffee on a desk after a sleepless night, or the sound of a typewriter that keeps working long after its owner has stopped believing in the words it is producing. The crash of 1929 was not an abstract economic event. It was a collection of faces, gestures, pauses. It was Harold, adjusting his tie one last time before stepping into an office that no longer existed. It was Louise, hiding an unpaid bill beneath the sugar jar so her children would not see it. It was the boy in the shoeshine chair, overhearing businessmen whisper the word ruined as though it were contagious. Every era has its tragedies, but the Great Crash was unique because it took everything familiar and made it unrecognizable. The city still looked the same towers, same avenues, same rhythm of traffic, but something invisible had shifted inside the people who walked those streets. One of the most haunting portraits from that time comes from a photograph. A man in a dark coat, standing at a newspaper stand, reading the headlines that announce the market's fall. His hat shades, his eyes, his expression unreadable. He is not weeping or raging. He is just, still. You can almost feel him calculating what parts of his life are gone and which might still be recoverable. That expression became the mood of a generation, quiet shock mixed with reluctant dignity. In office buildings across Manhattan, clerks went on typing. The rhythm of work became a shield against despair. They balanced ledgers already meaningless, filed papers that no one would ever read again. The small, mechanical gestures were how people survived the absurdity of it all. You see it again and again in accounts from that winter. The ordinary stubbornness of continuing. A banker whose firm had folded still polished his shoes each morning, rode the train downtown, and sat on a park bench near his old office from 9 to 5. When a friend asked why, he said, "It is easier to pretend I am late than unemployed." There is a strange nobility in that kind of denial. It is not self-deception so much as self-preservation. Others responded differently. A young broker named Alan left Wall Street entirely and began selling apples from a wooden crate. At first, it was survival. Later, it became routine. Someone once asked him how it felt to go from trading thousands of dollars to trading fruit. He shrugged and said, "The profit margin's better. The risk is smaller." That is the kind of humor that keeps people from breaking. Further uptown, you would find people like Miriam the secretary, who lost her job when her employer's firm collapsed. She started typing letters for neighbors to earn a few cents. "You find out what you can do when you have no choice," she wrote in her diary. It is not bravery, it is math. The human portraits from this period show something raw and oddly beautiful. The slow rediscovery of what truly matters when everything external disappears. Families began to gather again, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. Apartment lights glowed longer into the night. Parents told children bedtime stories about better times, not to sugarcoat reality, but to keep imagination alive. Neighbors who barely spoke before now shared meals, coal, and cigarettes. That kind of closeness is born only in scarcity. For those who lived it, the crash stripped away the excess noise of success, the pride, the competition, the endless chase for more, and left behind the simplest truth: survival is a communal act. In soup kitchens that sprang up across the city, men who had once argued about investments now stood side by side, bowls in hand, waiting in the same line. There were no stocks there, no portfolios, no social ladders, only hunger, humility, and the faint smell of broth. There is an account from a volunteer at one of those kitchens who said that people never looked ashamed to eat. They looked grateful to be recognized. "We did not serve food," she said. "We served acknowledgement." It is easy to think of history as cold, impersonal, full of charts and crises. But beneath every statistic is someone who laughed less that year, someone who learned to sew instead of shop, someone who started walking everywhere because the streetcar was too expensive. That is what the crash really looked like. Even the wealthy were not immune. One socialite accustomed to hosting lavish parties was photographed quietly pawning her jewelry. When a reporter approached her, she said, "The hardest thing is not losing money. It is losing the illusion that I was smarter than chance." That sentence could have been written for everyone. The crash humbled people in different ways. For some, it erased arrogance. For others, it built empathy. For many, it forced a new kind of honesty, the kind you can't buy. The stock exchange had been built on the idea that everything could be calculated. That uncertainty was a puzzle waiting to be solved. But life, it turned out, was not arithmetic. It was weather, and weather can't be controlled, only endured. Those who survived longest were not necessarily the cleverest, but the ones willing to change shape, to take on smaller dreams, to find purpose in things that no longer glittered. By the time winter set in, Wall Street had quieted into something almost solemn. Offices were emptier, but not entirely abandoned. The people who remained carried themselves differently, less swagger, more steadiness. There is a diary entry from a clerk in December 1929 that reads, "It is strange. The city feels lighter now that everyone stopped pretending to be rich." It is not cynicism. It is relief. In crisis, pretense dies first. And in its place, humanity begins to show. Even art changed. Writers and painters started depicting ordinary lives again. Crowded kitchens, empty pockets, tired faces. They stopped painting skyscrapers and started sketching streets. The distance between ambition and humility grew shorter. And in that strange, painful transformation, America began to rediscover itself. Because when illusions fall away, what is left is not emptiness. It is raw material. The bones of a society learning how to breathe again. The crash did not just break fortunes. It revealed character. It showed who could adapt, who could care, who could stay kind even when stripped of comfort. One newspaper in 1930 ran an article titled "The New Millionaires of Dignity." It described barbers, teachers, shop clerks, and former brokers who had begun organizing community aid networks. People who once measured success in profit now measured it in usefulness. That is what tragedy does. It resets the scale. Even now, nearly a century later, the human portraits from that era remind us that collapse does not only destroy it, clarifies. It asks hard questions. Who are you when the market stops answering? What remains when the noise fades? For some, the answer was despair. For others, it was rediscovery. The crash stripped the shine from the decade, but it also stripped the fear from many hearts. Once you have seen how quickly the world can change, you stop clinging to illusions. You learn that value is not printed on stock certificates. It is built in relationships, in integrity, in the ability to start again. There is a photo from 1930 that captures it perfectly. 3 men standing in the snow outside the exchange, sharing a cigarette, laughing quietly. Their clothes are worn, their eyes tired, but there is warmth there. Not triumph, just endurance. And maybe that is the real portrait of 1929. Not despair, not chaos, not wealth turned to dust, but people rediscovering each other in the ruins. Because in the end, history does not remember the crash for its numbers. It remembers it for what came after. The way ordinary lives, stripped of pretense, learned to survive together. And that, more than any market recovery, was the truest form of wealth they ever found. The first shock of the crash hit fast, but its echo lasted years. It rippled outward from Wall Street into every ordinary life, seeping into kitchens, schools, and factory floors. What had begun as a problem of markets soon became a problem of mornings, how to face one more day when the familiar structure of the world had quietly disappeared. At first, people spoke of it as a downturn, a temporary setback. The newspapers urged patience. Politicians promised swift recovery. But by the winter of 1930, the optimism had thinned, replaced by something quieter and more enduring: fatigue. Factories slowed, then stopped. Storefronts, once glowing with electric signs, went dark. The word closed began appearing in more windows than anyone wanted to count. Men who had worked all their lives found themselves walking the streets in suits that no longer belonged to any job. If you passed through Lower Manhattan at dawn, you would see them standing in line outside employment offices, anxious, restless, holding hats in their hands. Some still carried briefcases, though they were empty now. It was not vanity, it was identity. The briefcase reminded them who they had been. One of those men, a former accountant, told a reporter that he kept going downtown each morning because his children thought he still had a job. "I can't bear to let them know yet," he said. "They still ask how work was." There is a kind of heartbreak in that sort of love, the tenderness of pretending for someone else's sake. By spring, the crisis had grown visible. Breadlines wound around corners, stretching through neighborhoods that had once seemed untouchable. The first soup kitchens appeared in church basements and community halls. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of cabbage, the murmur of quiet gratitude. A volunteer recalled how silent those rooms were. They did not talk while eating. They did not want to draw attention to hunger. They wanted to disappear. That silence carried across the country. It was not the silence of peace. It was the sound of endurance. In small towns, the rhythm of life changed shape. Farmers, already struggling under debt, now found no buyers for their crops. They watched wheat rot in fields, while families in cities went hungry. Some began trading directly, bartering milk for fuel, flour for repairs. Money had become too abstract to matter. Even the cities learned new rituals. On Sunday afternoons, you would see families walking together, not to shop, but simply to pass time. Parks became sanctuaries, free, open, a place where no one asked for proof of solvency. In those walks, something tender emerged. Fathers pointing out pigeons to children, couples sitting quietly on benches, the shared relief of realizing that not everything costs money. Still, the daily grind of survival took its toll. Landlords began evicting tenants who fell behind. Families doubled up in apartments meant for one. Streets, once elegant, grew crowded, with furniture piled on, sidewalks, chairs, mattresses, framed photographs, everything that had once made a home. People would pass by without speaking. To look too long was to admit that it could happen to you next. The loss was not just financial, it was existential. In one diary from 1931, a woman wrote, "We lost our house today. I thought I would cry. But instead, I just swept the floor one last time." That is the quiet dignity that filled those years, not the heroism of grand gestures, but the small grace of keeping routine alive amid ruin. Banks, too, began collapsing one by one. Savings vanished overnight. For many, that was the final betrayal. Money was not just currency, it was trust. When it disappeared, something moral collapsed with it. People began keeping cash in jars, hiding coins under floorboards. Even when prosperity returned years later, some never trusted banks again. The human body began to carry the weight of the era. Malnutrition became common. Doctors saw new illnesses born from deprivation. Children fainted in classrooms. The lucky ones still attended school. Many dropped out to help families survive, shining shoes or selling newspapers. A teacher from Chicago remembered her students bringing sandwiches wrapped in newspaper. Some were filled only with lard or onions. They did not complain, she said. They ate slowly, like it might be their last. And yet, even in deprivation, creativity found space. People learned to repair what could not be replaced. Dresses were turned into curtains, curtains into dresses again. Shoes were resoled until the leather thinned to tissue. Mothers traded recipes for meals made from almost nothing. Bean stews, bread stretched with water, pies filled with air and hope. There is beauty in that kind of invention, even when born from despair. For some, the loss of wealth meant the gain of perspective. Without the endless climb for more, people began to look sideways instead of upward toward each other. Communities formed mutual aid groups, sharing food, work, and even music. A neighbor's piano might fill the night air again, not because life was easy, but because melody was one of the few things left unscarred by debt. The crash had leveled hierarchies in a strange way. The gap between the once rich and the always poor narrowed not through justice, but through shared vulnerability. The illusion of class superiority cracked when everyone stood in the same line for soup. In that leveling, compassion returned. A barber refused payment from men looking too proud to ask for credit. A bookseller started a read now, pay, never policy. Churches and synagogues opened doors at night to those with nowhere to sleep. Ordinary kindness became the new currency. That is the part the history books rarely capture: the subtle transformation of a nation learning humility. Wall Street, meanwhile, had gone silent. The ticker that once sang with endless optimism now clicked with mechanical indifference. Brokers walked more softly. The exchange floor smelled of dust and resignation. For many, it became a symbol of betrayal, an altar that had promised salvation but offered none. And yet, people still gathered outside as if drawn by old habit. They stared up at the building like it might apologize. That is what the crash did. It replaced faith in markets with a haunting absence. The country realized, perhaps for the first time, that progress is not permanent, that wealth is not a shield, that the world can change faster than pride can adapt. Still, amid all this, life went on. It always does. Children played stickball in alleys. Couples married quietly, rings bought second-hand. Newspapers carried stories of small triumphs. A factory reopening, a man finding work after months of searching. Each success, no matter how modest, felt like rebellion against despair. And slowly, people began to rebuild, not the economy, but themselves. They learned new ways to measure worth. A good day was not one with profit, but one with food on the table and warmth in the house. Happiness shrank but deepened. By the early 1932, the country was no longer in freefall. It was in recovery of spirit. Artists began painting breadlines. Photographers captured dust and faces with quiet reverence. Writers recorded what it meant to lose and endure. The Great Depression would last years, but its emotional foundation had been poured in those first months after the crash. Resilience made from exhaustion, solidarity made from loss. And so, when we talk about the everyday consequences, we are not really talking about economics. We are talking about the anatomy of survival, about people who learned, painfully, that life is not measured by what you earn, but by what you keep giving when there is nothing left to trade. Because even when the ticker stopped, the world did not. It just found a slower rhythm, one shaped by empty pockets and full hearts. That rhythm carried them forward, through soup lines, through winters, through the long shadow of doubt. And maybe that is what history forgets most easily, not the crash, but the quiet courage it created. The ordinary grace of people who looked at the ruins of their plans, exhaled, and said, "All right, let us start again." You can measure a crash in numbers, but you can only understand it in silence. That is what lingered after 1929. Not just poverty or unemployment, but a new kind of quiet that lived inside people. For those who survived the first wave, the months that followed felt strangely hollow. It was not panic anymore. It was numbness. The city still moved, but more slowly. The sound of the ticker tape was gone. Even footsteps on Wall Street seemed to echo differently, as if the air itself had grown heavier. Everyone was pretending, in one way or another. Pretending not to be afraid. Pretending to still belong to a world that no longer existed. You would see it in small gestures. A man straightening his tie before walking into an office he knew might close by Friday. A woman polishing the same silverware every afternoon because routine was safer than despair. People clung to rituals, not because they meant anything, but because they were proof that time still moved forward. Psychologists had not yet invented words like economic trauma, but that is what it was. An invisible fracture that ran through entire communities. There is an account from a doctor in New York who said his patients all described the same dream falling through empty air and never landing. That was how they experienced the crash, not as an event, but as an endless descent. The body kept moving through the motions of life, but the mind stayed suspended in the moment of loss. For many, the hardest part was not hunger, it was humiliation. In a country that had built its identity on self-reliance, failure felt like sin. People did not just lose money, they lost the story they would told themselves about what kind of person they were. A banker who'd spent 20 years climbing the ladder now found himself taking orders from a younger man at a relief agency. A father who used to provide for his family now waited in line for bread, his hands tucked into his pockets so no one would see them shake. Pride, once a comfort, became a wound. One journalist described walking through Central Park in early 1931 and seeing men in suits feeding pigeons all day. "They look respectable," he wrote, "but their eyes have gone quiet. It is as if they are waiting for permission to exist again." That is what the crash did to people. It rearranged their relationship to the future. Before, the future had been a promise. If you worked hard enough, if you were clever enough, if you invested in the right places, you would get there. After 1929, the future became a question mark. Every assumption turned fragile. Every plan became conditional. Even the language of optimism broke down. Words like security, success, growth, they felt dishonest. People stopped talking about someday and started talking about tomorrow, sometimes just tonight. There is a letter from a man in Ohio to his brother, written in 1930, that says, "I used to think life was a staircase. Now it feels like a hallway with no doors." That sense of being trapped between what was lost and what had not yet begun was the quietest cruelty of all. Fear began to reshape behavior in subtle ways. People saved obsessively, even when there was little to save. They avoided risk of any kind. Even laughter changed less loud, more cautious. It was as if the entire nation had developed a superstition against joy, afraid it might trigger another fall. You could feel that tension in conversations. People did not talk about making it back. They said, "I am managing. We are getting by." It was survival disguised as modesty. In that atmosphere, shame spread like a shadow. Men avoided old friends rather than admit they would lost everything. Women hid their worn shoes under long skirts. Children learned not to ask questions. The crash was not just economic, it was emotional contagion. And yet, even in that darkness, something tender began to grow, a new kind of empathy born from shared vulnerability. People who'd once competed now looked out for each other. Former executives delivered food to neighbors. Churches organized coat drives without sermons. People began to redefine dignity, not as status, but as compassion. Still, the fear of falling again never left. It lived in gestures, the way someone folded money twice before pocketing it, the way they hesitated before buying anything unnecessary, the way they measured every decision against the memory of that one October morning. Even years later, when the economy began to recover, the survivors carried invisible scars. Some never invested again. Others refused to throw away old things. One woman who had lived through it was asked decades later why she kept so many empty jars in her basement. She smiled sadly and said, "Because once I had nothing to fill them with." That is what trauma looks like when it ages. It hides in habits. The artists of the time caught that feeling better than anyone. Painters stopped depicting grand city skylines and started painting faces, hollow eyes, stooped shoulders, small hands holding newspapers. Writers filled their pages with silence, with long pauses, ellipses, unfinished sentences. The age of confidence had become the age of hesitation. Even architecture changed. The towering optimism of the 20 seconds gave way to simpler, humbler forms. Buildings that no longer shouted wealth, but whispered endurance. The country's psyche had shifted from expansion to reflection. And yet, in that reflection, there was a strange sort of peace. When everything collapses, illusions go with it. What is left, while painful, is real. People began to see each other again, not as competitors, not as classes, but as fellow survivors. There is a story about a Wall Street messenger who used to deliver contracts between firms. After the crash, there was no work for him, but he kept walking the same route every day. One morning, a police officer asked why. The man replied, "Because if I stay home, I will start thinking. And if I start thinking, I will stop hoping." That line could have been the motto of the entire decade. Hope, for those years, was not loud or confident. It was small, almost invisible, a candle in a room, still filled with smoke. People learned to protect it carefully, to feed it with routine and humility. The crash had shattered the illusion of control, and in that shattering, people rediscovered something older: resilience, without arrogance. The kind of strength that does not announce itself, but refuses to die. By the mid-1930s, the world had changed again. Governments built new systems to prevent another disaster. Jobs returned, slowly. Cities began to hum once more. But for the generation that had lived through 1929, something fundamental had shifted. They no longer trusted permanence. They understood that security was temporary, that tomorrow could vanish without warning. And perhaps because of that, they began to live differently. Smaller dreams, steadier pace, deeper gratitude. The survivors did not speak about bouncing back. They spoke about standing still without falling. Psychological scars do not heal neatly, but they do reshape how people see the world. The crash taught millions that stability is not something you earn once. It is something you have to keep tending, like a fragile fire. And so they tended it, quietly. They saved, they worked, they loved carefully. They carried the memory of that morning like a folded letter, kept close, never forgotten. Because deep down, every survivor of 1929 knew the same truth: that prosperity is loud, but survival is silent. And it is in that silence, unsteady, humble, human, that they began, slowly, to rebuild not their fortunes, but themselves. When a society survives a fall that big, it does not return to what it was, it molts. The shell cracks, and something quieter steps out, blinking against the light. That is what happened after 1929. America did not just lose wealth, it shed a kind of innocence. The crash marked the end of an era that had believed in unstoppable ascent, in endless growth, in the idea that success was proof of virtue. Afterward, the country began to question itself, not loudly, not through rebellion, but through reflection. The 1920 seconds had been a performance. Jazz, champagne, bright lights, skyscrapers, The whole decade had danced to the beat of its own self-assurance. The crash turned off the music. Suddenly, the glitter looked garish, the slogans hollow. People who once worshipped the market began to see it as something dangerous, beautiful, yes, but unpredictable, like fire. In art, fashion, language, and politics, the tone shifted. The world traded confidence for conscience. Writers like Steinbeck and Dos Passos began documenting the human cost of ambition. Photographers turned their lenses away from skylines and toward faces lined, weary, unadorned. Songs slowed down. Even jokes changed. Humor became sharper, edged with melancholy. America had learned irony. In a single decade, the culture moved from the thrill of having it all to the quiet pride of getting by. The advertising of the early 1930 seconds tells the story better than any history book. Before the crash, ads had screamed, "Be the envy of your neighbor, own the future." Afterward, they whispered, "Built to last, good value for hard times." The same products, but different faith. The age of excess had given way to an age of endurance. That shift seeped into homes. Frugality became a virtue, not a shame. Waste not, want not, turned from a saying into a survival code. Hand-me-downs became heirlooms. A mended shirt was not a sign of poverty, it was a badge of respectability. And behind it all, an unspoken understanding spread. The illusion of permanence was over. People stopped trusting glitter. They began trusting hands their own, their neighbors. Skill replaced speculation as the measure of worth. Knowing how to fix something mattered more than owning it. The mechanic, the farmer, the seamstress, all those once overlooked became the quiet heroes of a shaken nation. Even religion, long content to bless prosperity, began preaching humility again. Sermons filled with talk of simplicity, of balance, of gratitude for enough. The market had once been treated like a god. Now it was just another flawed human creation, to be watched carefully, never worshipped again. That spiritual shift carried into the arts. The Hollywood of the early 1930 seconds turned darker, more honest. The glittering escapism of the silent era gave way to stories about survival. I am a fugitive from a chain gang, the grapes of wrath, gold diggers of 1933. These were not fantasies, they were reflections. The heroes were not invincible anymore. They were ordinary people trying not to drown. The same transformation unfolded in everyday conversation. Language simplified. Boasts grew smaller. The word luck replaced genius. People stopped saying when things get better and started saying if. Hope became humble, less about destiny, more about endurance. Politically, too, the country began to wake up from its fever dream of self-sufficiency. The government, once hesitant to interfere with markets, stepped into the breach. New laws emerged, banking reforms, public works programs, social safety nets. The crash had forced a moral reckoning. What is freedom worth if a single storm can destroy millions of lives? That question reshaped the national character. America became more skeptical of extremes of wealth that rose too fast, of power left unchecked. The idea of fairness, long buried under the noise of ambition, returned to the surface. People began demanding not just recovery, but justice. Yet even in that shift, something gentler was born. The culture began to value empathy again. The shared hardship of the Depression softened the lines between people. Strangers helped each other without asking for credentials. The distance between banker and farmer, between city and small town, began to narrow. Everyone, it seemed, had lost something. This shared vulnerability bred a different kind of unity, the kind that comes not from pride, but from pain. You could see it in photographs, a mother holding her child in a dust-choked field, her expression weary but unbroken. You could hear it in songs, slow and steady, voices carrying both grief and gratitude. The crash had shaken the foundations of wealth, but it had also reminded the country that dignity does not come from possession, it comes from persistence. Even fashion reflected the new humility. The extravagant flapper dresses disappeared. In their place came simpler cuts, muted fabrics, practical shoes. Clothes stopped shouting. They started listening. By the mid-1930s, that restraint had become the new aesthetic. Clean lines, strong materials, no excess. Architecture followed suit. The Art Deco towers that rose in those years were not just monuments to beauty. They were testaments to discipline. Strength, not sparkle, became the goal. This cultural sobering up did not mean the country stopped dreaming. It just dreamed differently. The fantasy shifted from luxury to stability, from adventure to belonging. Home became the most powerful word in the American vocabulary. Home ownership, home-cooked meals, homegrown values. After years of vertigo, people wanted solid ground. And yet, within that search for stability, something quietly poetic emerged: gratitude. When you have lost everything once, even small things start to glow. The smell of bread baking, the first paycheck after months of waiting, the sound of a neighbor's knock offering help instead of judgment. These became the new luxuries. The crash had erased illusions, but it had not erased wonder. If anything, it made wonder purer. Writers noticed it too. John Steinbeck wrote that the last clear function of man is to endure and to find meaning in endurance. That sentiment became the quiet mantra of the 1930 seconds. Endure. Not grandly, not heroically, but with grace. Even the laughter changed. People did not laugh to forget anymore. They laughed to survive. Jokes became small acts of rebellion, proof that despair had not won. You could hear it in bars, in factory lines, in the way someone would say, "At least the coffee's still hot." Humor became the new currency of hope. Looking back, the cultural transformation of the crash years was not about destruction, it was about recalibration. The country learned to see value where it had never looked before. In work, in craft, in patience, in each other. It is easy to call the Great Depression an economic catastrophe. But culturally, it was also a reckoning, a turning point between arrogance and awareness. The 1920 seconds had asked, "How high can we climb?" The 1930 seconds asked, "How deep can we care?" And maybe that is the quiet gift hidden inside every collapse. It strips away the decorations and leaves the foundation bare. And once you are staring at the bare foundation, you can finally decide what kind of world you want to build again. When the smoke cleared, America did not look the same. It looked older, wiser, more honest. The skyline was still there, but behind it lived a different kind of light, less dazzling, more human. A country that had once chased fortune now began to chase meaning. And in that pursuit, bruised but breathing, it found something it had almost forgotten: itself. History does not repeat itself exactly. It whispers. And the whisper of 1929 has never gone silent. You can still hear it every time a market chart surges upward too fast. Every time a new technology promises to change everything. Every time confidence begins to look suspiciously like faith. The faces have changed. The screens have replaced the ticker tape. But the rhythm is the same. Excitement, denial, collapse, regret. The Great Crash was not just an event. It was a pattern, a blueprint for how human optimism builds and how it unravels. Take the housing bubble of 2008. The story began differently, but followed the same emotional arc. People borrowed what they could not afford because everyone else was doing it. Banks turned risk into profit, convinced that the old rules did not apply anymore. Politicians called it innovation. Economists called it efficiency. It all sounded new, but it was not. It was 1929, rewritten in modern grammar. When it broke the same way. Panic in trading rooms, disbelief on faces, numbers falling faster than comprehension. Only the clothing had changed. Suits replaced by hoodies, ticker tape replaced by glowing screens. But beneath the technology, the same fragile psychology pulsed, the ancient human refusal to believe that a climb can end. We tell ourselves we are smarter now. We have data, algorithms, regulations. We say, this time is different. That phrase has been repeated before every collapse in history. It is almost an invocation. Each generation believes it is immune to gravity until the floor shifts again. The crash of 1929 was not caused by greed alone. It was caused by forgetfulness. The belief that progress erases risk. That is what makes it timeless. Look around today. The markets are digital now, global, instant. Money moves faster than thought. A rumor can erase billions in a second. It is as if the entire world is living inside the same nervous system, and when one neuron panics, the whole body trembles. You could call that efficiency or fragility. The parallels extend beyond money. Social media feeds run on the same principle as speculation, constant motion, endless optimism, the illusion of control. Everyone's a participant. Everyone's invested in attention, in identity, in numbers that rise and fall without meaning. When those numbers drop, when the algorithm shifts, it feels almost the same: the sinking stomach, the disbelief, the sudden silence after noise. What the people of 1929 discovered, we keep rediscovering. Confidence is a collective hallucination. It is real only as long as everyone believes in it, at once. When belief fractures, reality rushes in. There is a reason images from the crash resurface whenever crisis returns. Photographs of men standing outside the exchange, newspapers clutched in hand, look eerily familiar next to shots of traders watching red screens in 2008, or cryptocurrency investors watching graphs collapse in 2022. The technology changes, but the posture is identical: hands on temples, disbelief in the eyes, the same quiet question: how did this happen again? It happened because emotion never modernizes. We think of markets as logic engines, but they are really mirrors of fear and desire. They rise when we feel safe, they fall when we do not. Every number is a story about someone's hope. Every crash is a story about that hope dissolving. Even outside finance, the same pattern shows up in how societies handle power, fame, or innovation. Every boom creates its own myth. We have evolved past failure. Then reality catches up. The myth breaks. The same lesson repeats. No system, no matter how shiny, is immune to human nature. The 1,920 seconds had the radio and the automobile. The 2,020 seconds have artificial intelligence and digital currency. Different inventions. Same temptation to believe we have finally conquered uncertainty. But uncertainty is not an enemy to conquer. It is the condition we live in. That is the part a crash tried to teach us, and the part we keep forgetting. The survivors of 1929 became a generation defined by caution. They saved jars, mended clothes, distrusted extravagance. For their children, the ones who grew up watching parents count pennies, would go on to build one of the most stable economies in history. Caution, not innovation, saved them. Now, nearly a century later, we seem to be drifting back toward amnesia. Easy credit, speculative trends, fortunes made overnight on screens no one fully understands. It is the old dream in new clothing. History does not punish repetition, it just charges interest. The crash of 1929 was the loudest version of a story that happens quietly every decade somewhere in the world. A bubble of belief expands until it touches the edges of physics, and then pop, it becomes honesty again. But honesty, though painful, is the cure. That is what people in 1929 eventually discovered. When the glitter faded, what remained was not emptiness. It was clarity. They learned the difference between growth and greed, between value and vanity. The recovery was not just economic, it was moral. You can trace that same moral arc in later collapses. After 2008 came a new awareness of inequality, of exploitation, of systems too big to fail, yet too fragile to trust. After each fall, society rediscovers humility for a while, until memory fades and the cycle begins again. Perhaps that is why stories of the Great Depression still haunt us. They remind us that the line between confidence and delusion is thin, and that intelligence does not protect against emotion. They whisper a warning. Every era believes it is the exception. None are. Still, there is a comfort in recognizing the pattern. Because if collapse is cyclical, so is renewal. The people who lived through 1929 eventually rebuilt, not the same world, but a wiser one. They built safety nets, laws, habits. They taught their children to live within limits. They learned the hard way that resilience does not come from avoiding risk but from surviving it. That is the inheritance they left us, not their fear, but their realism. And yet, if you listen to the news today, you can almost hear the same music playing again, the excitement of new wealth, the mantra of infinite growth, the denial of limits. The dance continues. We are always one step away from believing the floor will hold forever. Maybe that is why we keep telling stories about 1929, not just to remember, but to warn ourselves. To remind ourselves that progress without humility eventually corrects itself. Because the market, like life, has gravity, and gravity does not negotiate. The crash taught us that every boom carries a shadow, that prosperity demands empathy, that optimism without caution becomes cruelty. It is a lesson that does not age, because human nature does not either. If the past whispers, the question is whether we still know how to listen. When you look at old photographs of men standing outside the exchange in their rumpled suits, you are not seeing strangers. You are seeing us only earlier in the cycle. You are seeing what happens when confidence runs out of air. And maybe the point is not to stop believing altogether, but to believe differently, to invest less in the illusion of control and more in the practice of awareness. To remember that stability is not permanent, but kindness can be. That is the real modern parallel. Not that history repeats, but that it invites. Each generation gets a chance to hear the echo of the last one and decide, will we listen or will we need to fall again to remember how fragile we are? The choice, as always, is ours. And if we ignore the whisper long enough, it will return as a roar. If there is one thing every collapse leaves behind, it is a mirror. When the noise fades, you are left staring at your own reflection, what you valued, what you ignored, what you were willing to risk for comfort. The crash of 1929 turned that mirror on an entire generation. And what it showed was uncomfortable. It revealed how easily belief can become blindness. For years, people had mistaken wealth for wisdom. The men who made fortunes were assumed to be brilliant, almost prophetic. They were not gamblers, they were captains of progress. When they lost everything, the myth cracked. The crash stripped away the glamour and left behind something ordinary, human error, repeated at scale. That realization changed more than markets. It changed conscience. People began asking new questions. What does success mean if it collapses this quickly? What kind of intelligence builds a system that can destroy itself in a week? What is the value of freedom if it only protects those already safe? Those questions did not have easy answers, but they reshaped the decade that followed. Out of disillusionment came reflection, and out of reflection came a quieter morality, one rooted not in ambition, but in awareness. The first moral lesson was about humility. The crash proved that no one, no company, no expert, no empire is immune to gravity. The smartest men in the world, armed with charts and confidence, had been wrong. That humbled people in a way no sermon ever could. It forced the world to see that progress is not linear. It bends, it breaks, it doubles back. The illusion of control was shattered, and for a moment, humanity remembered its scale. That humility became a moral foundation. It birthed caution where there had been arrogance. It made people question the ethics of endless growth. It turned extravagance into embarrassment and prudence into pride. The second lesson was about greed. The decade before the crash had glamorized excess. Spending was a sport. Borrowing was a lifestyle. The crash turned greed from a symbol of daring into a source of shame. People began to see that appetite without limit is indistinguishable from self-destruction. The same brokers who once bragged about risk now warned their children against it. Society began to view moderation as moral strength, not weakness. Wealth did not disappear, it just lost its halo. The third lesson was about interdependence. Before 1929, America believed in the myth of the self-made man. Afterward, it learned that collapse is collective. One person's speculation becomes another's starvation. The economy was not a ladder, it was a web. When one thread snapped, the rest trembled. That understanding birthed empathy in places where there had been isolation. The man standing in the breadline was not just unlucky. He was part of a system that had failed everyone. The crash turned I into we. The fourth lesson was about illusion. The 1,920 seconds had treated money as magic numbers, rising without labor, fortunes created by faith alone. The crash reminded the world that value can't live only in paper or pixels. Real worth lies in things that endure when illusions burst: skill, kindness, time, honesty. That is why people began saving not just money, but meaning. They built lives around stability instead of spectacle. They learned that wealth without wisdom is a hollow thing, a house made of glass in a world that loves throwing stones. The fifth lesson was about resilience. The crash destroyed fortunes, but it did not destroy humanity. It showed that survival does not require certainty, just persistence. The people who lived through it did not rebuild through genius, but through endurance. They worked, they waited, they adapted, and in doing so, they discovered that dignity does not depend on success. It depends on showing up. One man who lost everything later said, "It was not the fall that taught me anything. It was the standing back up." That sentiment became the quiet, moral core of the 1,930 seconds. Life was not about never falling again. It was about learning how to live with the knowledge that you could. The sixth lesson was about memory. The survivors carried the crash like a ghost that followed them everywhere. They taught their children thrift, caution, humility, not as paranoia, but as protection. The phrase, "Remember 1,929, became less a warning than a prayer. For decades afterward, that memory acted as ballast. It kept society from drifting too far into fantasy. It reminded people that bubbles do not burst out of nowhere. They are built inch by collective forgetting. And that, perhaps, is the hardest truth of all. Forgetting is seductive. The crash did not happen because people were evil. It happened because they were comfortable. Success dulled vigilance. Progress made humility seem outdated. People stopped asking hard questions because easy answers felt better. That is the real moral failure, not greed or speculation, but the refusal to remember that fragility lives in everything we build. In the aftermath, some tried to moralize the crash as divine punishment, a biblical cleansing of excess. But the lesson was smaller and more human. When we confuse comfort with safety, we stop noticing the cracks. That is the story that repeats through time. It is not about money, it is about blindness. Every era builds its own version of invincibility, a market, a technology, an empire, and every era eventually learns the same lesson, that no tower is too tall to fall, and no fall is final if humility returns afterward. For those who lived through 1,929, morality became simpler. They did not need manifestos or philosophies. They just lived differently. They worked honestly, spent cautiously, trusted slowly. They measured worth not in possessions, but in persistence. That is what moral maturity looks like after catastrophe, not moralizing, but modesty. In a sense, the Great Crash was a teacher disguised as disaster. It stripped away everything superficial and left behind first principles: balance, empathy, restraint, respect for limits. It also revealed a subtler truth: progress without morality is not progress. It is acceleration toward a cliff. The generation that rose from the wreckage did not see the crash as failure. They saw it as correction, a painful but necessary reminder that prosperity has to serve purpose, not ego. That is the kind of wisdom that can only be learned the hard way, by losing what you thought mattered and discovering what actually does. Even now, when markets rise and optimism returns, the moral echo of 1929 still hums beneath the noise. It asks quiet questions that never age. Are we learning or repeating? Are we building safety or spectacle? Are we chasing growth or meaning? Those are the questions the crash left us with. They are not lessons you graduate from, they are lessons you live inside. Because in the end, morality is not about avoiding another fall. It is about remembering the ground beneath your feet and walking lightly enough not to break it again. By the time the panic faded and the last echoes of the crash dissolved into memory, something new had settled over the world, a long, thoughtful quiet. Not resignation, exactly. More like a pause. A collective exhale from a generation that had looked straight into the machinery of its own illusions and lived to tell about it. It is easy, from the distance of history, to flatten 1929 into a headline. The Great Crash. Numbers plummeting, banks closing, fortunes vanishing overnight. But for those who lived through it, it was not an event. It was an atmosphere. It seeped into every room, every conversation, every heartbeat. It did not just happen. It stayed. And when it finally began to lift, people were different. The survivors did not speak of recovery in the way politicians did. Recovery, to them, was not about numbers or graphs. It was about quiet mornings, a warm cup of coffee that did not taste like fear, a job that lasted through the week. They had learned, painfully, that stability is the rarest luxury of all. You can almost imagine one of them, an older man, sitting at a cafe window in 1935, the hum of the street soft and steady again. He stirs his coffee slowly, watching sunlight spill through the glass. Around him, the world has resumed its rhythm. The shops are open. The factories hum. But in his eyes there is still a shadow, the memory of a time when all this had disappeared overnight. He does not hate the market. He does not worship it either. He simply respects it, the way you respect the ocean, beautiful, vast, and utterly indifferent. That is the quiet wisdom that the crash left behind. Understanding that control is an illusion and humility is a kind of armor. For a while, that wisdom shaped everything. People began to save, not hoard. They began to plan, not gamble. The generation that came of age during the Depression carried that restraint like a badge. They built families slowly, homes modestly, hopes carefully. Their lives might have looked smaller, but they were stronger in the places that counted. It is not the kind of triumph that makes for headlines. It is the kind that rebuilds a world. Because the crash, brutal as it was, did not destroy the human instinct to hope it purified it. It burned away the vanity and left only the essentials, the will to endure, the grace to adapt, and the humility to begin again. And in that way, the story of 1929 is not really about markets or money. It is about perspective, about what happens when everything collapses and you realize the ground underneath you still exists, that you still exist. For every man who lost his fortune, there was another who found his purpose. For every tower that emptied, a family learned how to live with less. The crash rearranged the world's definition of wealth, less about accumulation, more about connection. Neighbors became lifelines. Simple meals became rituals. The measure of success shrank but deepened. Years later, when the economy roared again, many survivors watched from a distance. They saw a new generation rise with the same old optimism, young people buying on credit, talking about endless growth. Some smiled, some worried, but most just said, they will learn. Not with bitterness, but with recognition, because experience had taught them that history does not punish. It educates in the slowest, hardest way possible. And maybe that is what makes the story of the crash still worth telling, not as a warning, but as a mirror. Every time we hear about a bubble bursting, every time we chase the next big thing, every time we mistake speed for strength, that mirror waits for us. It reflects the same truth over and over, that progress without memory always circles back to humility. When we look at those black and white photographs, the brokers on the steps, the bread lines in the snow, the quiet faces staring into nothing, it is tempting to feel pity. But if you look closely, there is something else in those expressions: resolve. They are not just mourning what they lost, they are measuring what remains. And what remained was enough. That is the quiet miracle of survival, the discovery that enough is a kind of abundance. The moral of the story is not that ambition is evil or that risk should be feared. It is that both need boundaries. Growth without reflection turns to greed. Confidence without caution turns to collapse. The people of 1929 learned this not through philosophy, but through hunger, through shame, through rebuilding brick by brick. It is easy to think of that generation as broken, but maybe they were simply refined, tempered by hardship, into something more enduring. Their world had shattered, yes, but when they rebuilt it, they chose stronger materials, community, empathy, realism. And maybe that is the real legacy of the crash, the reminder that ruin and renewal often arrive hand in hand. That collapse is not the opposite of progress. It is part of it, the painful correction that brings us back to truth. We can see echoes of that same cycle everywhere, when economies crash, when movements fail, when personal lives implode. The pattern is the same. First denial, then despair, then the slow return to meaning. We rebuild, not because we forget, but because we remember. In that sense, 1929 was less a tragedy than a teacher. It taught that wealth can vanish overnight, but integrity endures, that systems can fail, but people can choose decency anyway, that the world, though indifferent, can still be navigated with care. The crash stripped away noise, and what it left was honesty. Maybe that is the final gift of every collapse, the chance to start over, lighter, clearer, closer to what matters. When you stand far enough back, the crash does not look like an ending. It looks like a turning point. The day a civilization remembered its own humanity. And perhaps that is why the story still resonates a century later. Because we keep building new versions of the same illusion, and every so often the world reminds us gently, or brutally, that balance matters more than brilliance. So, as the lights of the exchange flickered back on, and the streets of New York began to hum again, the people who had lost everything carried something priceless. Perspective. They would learned that nothing, no fortune, no institution, no promise, is truly stable unless it is rooted in humility. The market recovered. The nation rebuilt. But the best thing that survived was not the economy. It was the quiet wisdom that comes from surviving yourself. That is the real story of 1929. Not the crash, not the fall, but what came after: the stillness, the reawakening, the choice to keep living with eyes open. Because the end of certainty is not the end of hope. It is the beginning of understanding. And so, when we look back at the great crash of 1929, we are not just revisiting a chapter of financial history, we are revisiting a story about being human, about how entire nations can rise on faith, fall on fear, and still find their way back through something quieter than confidence: resilience. The numbers will always matter to economists. The billions lost, the percentage drops, the charts that fell like cliffs. But to the people who lived it, the meaning ran deeper. It was about mornings that began with uncertainty and ended with survival. About learning that hope does not vanish when the money does. It simply changes shape. The crash stripped away illusions and left behind a question that still follows us: what truly sustains us when everything else collapses? For the survivors, the answer was not theory or policy, it was each other. It was the small, ordinary acts of courage that never made the headlines. A mother sharing bread, a man giving up his coat, a child learning to smile despite hunger. Those moments did not rebuild the market, but they rebuilt something more fragile: the sense that life, even in ruin, still has worth. Nearly a century later, the story still echoes. Every time a market trembles, every time we chase prosperity faster than wisdom, the past leans forward to whisper, remember. Remember that stability is borrowed, not owned. Remember that progress without empathy collapses. Remember that the only thing stronger than fear is decency. The great crash was not just an end. It was a turning point, a mirror held up to a civilization drunk on speed, forcing it to slow down and see itself clearly for the first time. And perhaps that is what we need again and again: a pause long enough to recognize that the value of life is not measured in gain, but in grace. So, tonight, as we close this story, maybe take a breath. Picture those streets of 1932, New York, the silence after the storm, the weary faces turning toward dawn. Somewhere among them, an old man is lighting a cigarette. A young woman is walking home with bread in her hands, and both are thinking the same thing: we are still here. And that is the quiet truth behind every crash, every ending, every human storm. We are still here. Thank you for listening, for walking through this story with patience and heart. Until next time, take care of your hope, your history, and the small, steady things that keep you standing when the world forgets its balance. Good night.